Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's event to celebrate the publication of Martin Shaw's latest book, which is a wonderful potted history of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. The structure for tonight's discussion is quite a straightforward one, I think. Martin's going to give a presentation of 20 minutes or so, and we're also then going to have some comments from Mary Kaldor. My name, I should have said that at the beginning, is Luke Cooper, and I work in the Conflict and Civicness Research Group at LSE Ideas. This event tonight is being organised by LSE Library, and if you didn't know, LSE Library hosts the archive of the Campaign of Nuclear Disarmament. That's actually one of many peace and human rights and justice archives that we host here at the LSE, and they're very proud to host, and actually one of a wider suite of archives on the radical history, keeping alive the radical history of the London School of Economics, which is not always easy, but they do a marvellous job. And so they host the European Nuclear Disarmament archive. They host a range of other ones as well. So those archives,
nice early ones, actually.
Yes. Yes, I do have some of them written down, but it's a whole suite, and you can gain access to them without being a member of LSE Archive. So if you want to do your own research into the peace movement tonight, do go and talk to someone from the library. We also have copies of the book to sell as well. And the very last thing I need to say, which is an administrative function, is that tonight's event is being recorded. And if you would like your question, if you ask one later, not to feature in the public recording, just let Daniel from the library know. So without further ado, Martin, can I hand over to you and congratulate you on the publication of this book. It is really a wonderful, concise history. I know people live very busy lives these days, and you can rattle through it very quickly, is one of the selling points, and it must have been quite hard to fit this rich, complicated, variegated, heterogeneous history into this, and I'm sure you cut out a lot. So tell us about the arguments and the story.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Luke and Mary, for coming here, and thank you everybody for coming to take part in the discussion and hear what I've got to say. Yeah, right. Okay, is that good?
That's great, yes, just for the recording.
Well, this book describes something like 73 years of anti-nuclear campaigning in Britain. And so that is 6 years even before the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament was founded. Clearly, I'm not going to summarise that whole history I'm going to say in 20 minutes tonight. Rather, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the writing of the book and the approach, and I'm going to talk about some issues in understanding and some issues really in the movements and the campaign for nuclear disarmament in this country and with implications internationally, and about how we understand these. And I think I'm not going to talk very really about the implications for the situation we face with nuclear weapons today, and what the movement against nuclear weapons should be doing in the present period. That's something obviously which people may well be thinking about, and we could talk about in the discussion, but I'm not really going to explore that. Now, when I was asked to write this book, and I suppose one of the reasons it's a short history is because that was what I was asked to write, and I hadn't done the research for a long history. After I'd done the research, I very much wished I had been writing a longer history, and I kept pushing the publishers to give me a bit extra space. But I hope it has value as for bringing the issues together in an accessible length. Now, I was asked to write a short history of CND, But I pointed out, and a bit of market research quickly established, that most people under the age of 50 didn't understand what CND meant. I'm sure that's not true for people in this room, but for the general population, and even people you might have expected to know didn't know. And the bigger problem with that was that CND as an organisation isn't really the story, or at least it's by no means the whole story. So the book is called The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the sense of describing the campaign is in its entirety, including all its different strands, of which CND as an organisation is a very important, indeed a central part, but by no means the whole story. Now, the other thing to say is that as a history, it is not overtly analytical in any sort of macro sense. Clearly there is an analysis in there, but I am not trying to, it isn't written in order to display a sort of high-level analytical argument or theoretical approach. So what I'm going to do in this talk is really to try and pull out some analytical themes, which are also, I think, political themes, and to talk about how these manifest themselves in different stages of the campaign. Now, I could have used the term movement instead of campaign. Indeed, a moment or two ago, I used these terms more or less interchangeably. But I think from an analytical point of view, the term movement implies something more than campaign. I use the term movement in the sense of a mass movement. So when a campaign mobilizes hundreds of thousands or millions of people, as the anti-nuclear campaign did at times, then I think that's something different from when it's a relatively small campaign mobilizing thousands or tens of thousands of people. And the anti-nuclear campaign was a movement only really in two periods, the late 50s to the early 1960s and the first half of the 1980s. And the first wave of the anti-nuclear movement in the 1950s and early 60s was, together with the civil rights movement in the United States, really the first modern mass protest movement of a type which has become very familiar since then. But in the 1950s, it was extremely novel. And these two movements, more or less simultaneous, linked in various ways because some key actors within these two movements were in fact connected. These represent a sort of prototype of a modern mass protest movement, which has been followed by many different sorts of movements in many different countries over the succeeding decades. And so in the history of the anti-nuclear campaign, we have these two mass movement periods, but we also have a period, we have the build-up to the first mass movement in the earlier 1950s. We have a period between the mid-60s and the end of the 70s when the campaign shrank back to really very small numbers. Indeed, in 1973, the CND had an older master march which had only 300 people on it, and they discussed whether they should disband. So it was that small, whereas 10 years earlier they'd had 150,000 people on the equivalent march. So dramatic expansions and contractions of the movement. But the inter-movement period, this period in the late 60s and 70s, was actually very important in the sense that this is when the example of CND, in a sense, was replicated in other movements. First of all, the movement against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, into which actually CND itself became absorbed, and then movements like the women's movement and the environmental movement, which were dominant in the 1970s, which emerged and became massive in the 1970s, which of course in many ways changed the face of radical politics. And these movements then fed into the revived anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s. So the anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s was against nuclear power, whereas predecessor had basically been in favour of it because of the environmental movement. The anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s was basically feminist and was heavily influenced by the women activists of the Greenham Common camp because of the emergence of the women's movement in the previous decade. So we have these sort of dynamics between movements as well as within the anti-nuclear movement, which I think are incredibly important. And obviously anti-war movements have been very important for C&D, so and for the whole campaign. So as I said, in the late 1960s, anti-nuclear activism was diverted, in a sense, into the campaign against the Vietnam War. In the 2000s, notably, it became part of the campaign against the Iraq War of 2003, and that of course was also a mass movement, and a very large mass movement, and it's one that held the largest single demonstration in British history in February 2003. So in the 2000s, the campaign for nuclear disarmament in its broadest sense, and C&D as an organisation became part of, essentially, or a dimension, an element of a broader anti-war movement. So we have these sorts of dynamics. One of the things that I want to emphasise, I think, comes out very strongly, is that the movement dynamics are very different from the logics of small campaigns. So you have different relationships between leaders and centres and followers and rank and file. You have, because you have a mass rank and file in a large movement, you have much more interaction, you have much more coming from the grassroots, perhaps, than you do in a small campaign. And differences in orientation within mass movements are magnified because the stakes become larger. So there's much more scope for distinct alternative leadership groups or centres of activism. So we see in the first phase of the anti-nuclear campaign, in the first movement in the late 50s, early 60s, we see the dynamic between the original campaign, actually before C&D itself was formed, we had the Direct Action Committee Against Nuclear War, which was a campaign by pacifist activists. And then we had the formation of C&D itself, which was essentially formed by the great and good of the left liberal establishment. And then, very quickly, the dynamism of the campaign which they were leading was replaced by, or came into conflict with a much more radical new tendency, the Committee of 100, into which the original Direct Action Committee was absorbed, and which became the centre of a much more direct actionist campaign. So we had these sorts of dynamics. And in the second wave, in the second movement in the 1980s, C&D wasn't even really the organisation of the movement to start with. We had the European Nuclear Disarmament, in which Mary and I and other people, so perhaps in this room, were involved. We had, of course, the Greenham Common Camp, which also, so both END and Greenham were, I describe them both as centres of the movement in different senses. They were different types of centre, but they were both key focal points alongside C&D, which re-emerged and which became a very powerful organisation led at the time by Bruce Kent and Joan Ruddock, and it certainly made the biggest public impact in British politics. But in terms of the movement, the way the movement itself was developing, there were these different centres. I talk about it actually as being network of networks rather than, if you like, a top-down centralized movement. And movements of this kind have potentially greater impacts on policy and politics, I would argue, and you know, I think the stakes are much higher in that sense, and they have greater impacts on culture and society in a wider sense, and that's something that's very important to understand about the anti-nuclear movement. That it did have, particularly in those two periods, very big impacts, I think, on culture and society, and on radical politics, obviously. And the other thing to say, as I've already hinted at when I talked about the CND and the Committee of 100 in the first wave, there's much more dynamic development within a movement, a mass movement. You know, these periods of high activism, about roughly 5 or 6 years each at their peak, were periods of tremendous ferment and change, and you know, so many people put so much of their time and energy into these movements, and so there was a lot of radicalization within the movements. Now, what I wanted to do, I can see I'm already taking a lot of the time I was going to give, it was just to pick out some key tensions and contradictions in the two movements in particular, although to some extent within the campaign as a whole, including its continuation in the 21st century. The tension between the fact that nuclear weapons are a global issue, but movements and campaigns have been national in orientation, and this is true across the world. It's not just that the British were particularly nationalist. This is true generally, and so there's always been a tension between the national focus, unilateral nuclear disarmament, especially in the British case, and the wider European and international goals. And of course, the big change in the second wave was that the movement went beyond the original idea of unilateral nuclear disarmament by Britain towards the idea of a pan-European campaign to stop the installation of cruise missiles, to get rid of intermediate-range nuclear weapons generally, and indeed to change the Cold War. So that's one tension. The second tension is the tension between, if you like, nuclear and geopolitical objectives. Is the campaign opposed to all nuclear weapons, or only mainly to Western ones? What is its attitude to the blocs? So CND was founded as a campaign against nuclear weapons, but in 1960, on a proposal by Stuart Hall, no less, it agreed to campaign for the UK to withdraw from NATO. That was, a very fateful, decisive decision, I think. END, though, when it came along, worked for the mutual dissolution of the blocs. And of course, clearly, that's the question of, the attitude of the anti-nuclear campaign towards NATO is a big question today because of the changing politics around NATO and nuclear weapons. Tension between legal campaigning, protest and direct action. The campaign actually began with direct action, with pacifists taking direct action in 1952, but it also began with a very conventional formal campaign, the National Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons Test, founded in 1956, and both of these strands fed into the movement at the end of the 1950s. And in the first movement, as I've indicated, there was a big conflict between the legal, formalistic CND leadership, which wanted to focus on converting the Labour Party to nuclear disarmament, and the direct actionists of the DAC and the Committee of 100.
Oh.
And but in the 1980s, there was, and since then, there has been much more reconciliation between these tendencies. They aren't seen as so much opposed There's a tension between absolute and nuclear pacifism. Should the movement oppose all war and only oppose conventional wars, or only oppose conventional wars when they threaten nuclear war? Or, in some people's minds, I think, when they are carried out by the West. And what is the alternative to nuclear weapons? Is it civil resistance, as many people argued, especially in the first phase, or alternative conventional defense of some kind? So these big issues that needed to be resolved. The question of violence and non-violence in the campaign itself. Is non-violence an absolute principle, or is it a tactic? Is it a tactical commitment? And how should non-violence be interpreted? So in the first phase of the campaign, even obstructing lorries entering missile sites was seen as maybe too provocative by some people, but that sort of obstruction later became normalized, and of course the question became, was it legitimate to carry out some sort of coercive or even violent action? And certainly in some of the movements which followed from CND, like the anti-Vietnam War movement, those sorts of questions arose. And they arise today because there is a strong strand of direct action campaigning in this country, which is based around the idea of plowshares and the idea of hammering nuclear and other military hardware, literally taking a hammer to them to remove them. So those sort of issues. The tension between political campaigning and the demands of communication. So one of the books which I found most useful and innovative in this was Christopher R. Hill's book, the name of which has gone out of my head actually. Anyway, which he looks at the relationship between the early movement and the media. And really, I think this is very important, that the political campaign movement has to communicate its ideas to its audience, and the relationship with the changing media. He argues that the coming of television was crucial, and that the movement became dependent in a way on television, but also then that its tactics radicalized because activists had to find new ways of getting attention from the media. So those sort of issues are still, I think, very much with all sorts of campaigns and movements today. Other tensions, the relationships between anti-nuclear politics and human rights, between anti-NATO politics and supporting opposition to authoritarian regimes. So in European Nuclear Disarmament, which Mary especially was involved in, and I was involved in, there was a big effort to engage with East European oppositionists to link peace and human rights. But there were many sections of the anti-nuclear movement and people in CND who did not agree with that, or not fully, and there were a lot of tensions around it. And the conflicts, there were conflicts within the campaign as it had really become again by the 1990s, over Bosnia, over Kosovo, and there are conflicts around Ukraine today, which I discuss in the book. So these sorts of wars where denials of human rights are being carried out by authoritarian regimes which are not linked to the West have aroused controversy in a way that, for example, the Iraq War or the earlier Gulf War, or indeed the Gaza War, have not done, where disarmers have tended to be united in opposing these wars. Tensions, I'm coming to a conclusion, I'm going on a bit, but tensions around seeking policy change from government versus developing broader radical or even revolutionary consciousness. And these were the tensions that were involved in the first wave between the CND leadership and the DAC and the Committee of 100. In the second wave between the CND leadership and the Greenham camp. and they revolve around the roles of groups like the New Left in the first wave, and European Nuclear Disarmament, and the various Marxist and anarchist groups. Finally, and last but not least, you'll be pleased to hear, I think we can pick out tensions between the character of the movements, especially as social as well as political movements, because people experience these movements, especially perhaps young people who became involved in them, as liberating, as transformational. So the Older Master Marches in the first wave, and Greenham especially, and other direct action activities in the second wave, were seen as involving, sort of new forms of life, new social forms. The protest camp, which we've seen in the Gaza movement, emerged out of Greenham. That was the prototype. But also here there was a potential for conflict. So, for example, in 1983, when cruise missiles were being installed in Britain, the CND leadership wanted to hold protests, mixed protests, men and women, at the Greenham Common camp, base rather, and the women of the Greenham Common Peace Camp, which was all women only, were resisted this action. So a moment of high tension in the history of the movement at a very politically pivotal point, where and this was because for the women in the camp represented more than a protest against cruise missiles. It also represented an alternative way of constituting women's collective living and a different ethos. I mean, I think in the end, the CND backed down, and there was no mixed protest, and it probably didn't make any big difference actually, but it certainly was a big deal at the time. So, in conclusion, did the movement succeed? And I'm going to say very little about this, but first of all, sorry, you can talk about it, certainly. First of all, I'd say the first movement obviously didn't in its manifest aims, but echoing what I've just said, the main study that was done of people who took part in that, 20 years later, the study was done, and about a third of the people who've been involved thought it did succeed, just because of what it created itself in its internal character, the participatory, emancipatory politics that it had created. The 80s movement, well, I mean, I argue in the book that effectively it was defeated in 1983 because the cruise missiles were installed. But then 4 years later, the missiles were removed. And that is partly down to Gorbachev, well, quite substantially down to Gorbachev, but I think I argue in the book that the movement played a decisive part as well. And I wanted to end by recalling, because I tried to pack in quite a lot of detail. That was one of the frustrating things about having only a limited number of words. But one of the things that struck me, I thought I would end on, was something I picked up from an article about when Mary went to Kazakhstan in 1988 and to watch short-range missiles being blown up on a Soviet military base. And in the article, you say that the commander, you said to the commander, congratulations on doing this, and he turned around and said, congratulations to you too.
Yes, he did. It was a great moment.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I've been working with Mary for many years, and I know a lot of her stories, but it's quite funny that I didn't know that story and read about it in Martin Shaw's book. I just want to ask Martin, before we go to Mary, I was wondering, there's a theme of the story that you tell about the prompting of geopolitical events for the movement, and the one that I like that's in there is the public interview that President Truman gave, where he confessed or stated that the Americans had considered using a nuclear weapon in the Korean War.
Yeah.
And I thought there was something we could talk a little bit more about there, because in the 1950s, the Americans were preparing to fight a nuclear war. It was before the mutually assured destruction period. And how did that affect the arguments of the movement?
Well, I think actually it's a good thing you mentioned that, because because it's such a long history, and the 80s are so interesting, and Mary and I were involved in them in a way that we weren't in the earlier period. It's easy to focus on that, but the period, the late 40s and the 50s, were really a period of much greater military tension in many ways, and Britain played a crucial role, really. It was America's unsinkable aircraft carrier, and I mean, one of the things I discovered, which I didn't really know or hadn't remembered before I wrote the book, was that in the late 50s and the early 60s, we had these Thor intermediate range nuclear missiles, which were scattered across 20 different bases in eastern England, 3 missiles at each base, and these were really the cutting edge of a potential American nuclear strike on the Soviet Union at that time, because intercontinental ballistic missiles hadn't really come in fully at that stage. So this was the most dangerous period in many ways, with the period before 1962 and Cuba, and I think it's no accident really that that tremendous movement developed in the late 50s because of the growing awareness of all this sort of thing that was going on. I mean, the Truman thing, yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, it's only one, I suppose, of a number of cases in which we know that the United States was considering using nuclear weapons. I mean, what was interesting to me was that enough MPs were angry about it that Attlee scuttled across to Washington, which wasn't quite as easy in those days as it is today, and tried to get assurances from the Americans that that if it came to it, there would be dual control over the use of the weapons, and he didn't really get that, and the British never really did get that, including over cruise missiles.
Really interesting, and I now want to bring in Mary Kaldor. I think it's fair to say, as Martin's already argued, that this was quite formative for you, the European nuclear disarmament period in the 1980s, your worldview, your ideas, your academic scholarship. So, yeah, tell us about some of that history and what you achieved to bring about the end of the Cold War.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I do recommend that you read Martin's book. It's a very good read. It sort of manages, despite being short, to cover everything. And actually, as always, going back to when we first met, I always agree with Martin. So it's very difficult to find things we disagree on. We always have agreed. Anyway, that's the first thing. The second thing I really like is what Martin said, which is that I do think, oh gosh, you can't hear this, but I just have to turn it off. It's ringing in my ear. Because I've got hearing aids and they ring in my ear. Oh God, sorry Peter, I do apologize, everybody. So the first thing I wanted to say is I think, what the point that Martin makes is that CND was the sort of prototype for the new social movements is a hugely important point. I think the whole repertoire that was developed in CND, whether it was the local nuclear free zones, the networks of scientists and doctors, really became a sort of model for other movements. And it was very new. I mean, we now think of peaceful protest as normal, and in a way, I think, what happened in 1989 was the kind of culmination of all that. These were these big peaceful demonstrations, and we now take it for granted that this is the way we do activism, and we're much more likely to do activism in this way rather than, say, join a political party or join a guerrilla force or become an insurgent. And I think that was a huge, I don't know how to tell this person. I think that was a huge change in how we do it. I mean, if you think about it, I'm just listening to a book about the 1848 revolutions, and it was taken for granted that they were violent, whereas now we take it for granted that political protest is peaceful. So I think that's a huge legacy of CND. Now back to your question, did we succeed? And I think you can say that the first CND movement produced the Partial Test Ban Treaty. So that was a sort of success. And I think you're right that the second wave produced the 1987 INF Treaty. And I would say, even if you attribute it to Gorbachev, that actually Gorbachev's concept of reasonable sufficiency actually came out of ideas that were associated with the peace movement. We were all talking then about defensive defense, non-nuclear, conventional defensive defense, which at the moment I'm trying to revive again. But I think that had a big influence on Gorbachev. In fact, we know it did, because we talked to the people around him. And he called it reasonable sufficiency, and the argument that you don't need enough weapons to destroy the world several times over. If you believe in nuclear deterrence, you could just have a few. He very much accepted that. Then there's the question of, did we contribute to the end of the Cold War? That's less about CND and more about END. But I think we did. I think we did, both in the case, both because of Gorbachev and reasonable sufficiency, but also because those connections that we made across the East-West divide, joining up with human rights groups, the fact that the official peace committees saw the peace movement as their fifth column, you know, they thought that they controlled us, meant that we actually had privileged access, and we could say to them, how can you be serious about peace if you don't create space for human rights groups? And I think all those connections we made did create more and more space. And by the end of the 80s, there was a whole new generation of groups that were both for human rights and peace. And it was those that organized the 1989 revolutions. Now, there may be lots of other reasons why the Cold War collapsed, but there is a question of agency, and I think we played a really important role in agency. So, having said that, I've been thinking today about the issue in a much more general sense, both globally and in the British context. I mean, okay, we won those victories, but we still live in a world where there are 12,000 nuclear weapons. And, you know, why did, you can say, well, there are 12,000 now instead of, I don't know how many there were in the 50s.
I think at the peak there were about 50,000, weren't there?
About 50,000, yeah. So there's been reductions. We've got the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which is a huge achievement, and 77 countries have signed it. We have the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So a lot of things have happened. We have nuclear-free zones in Latin America. But nevertheless, we're in a phase of modernization of nuclear weapons. All the nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear weapons. And we see Putin threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So it's become an issue again more than ever. So did we succeed? And I think, and then I think the question in the British context, which is what I'd like to say something about, is much more dire. I think we failed totally in the British context. And we see ourselves at the moment having a new phase of nuclear weapons, almost entirely bought from the United States, hugely expensive at a time when we claim that we can't afford our public services, and absolutely useless. because the whole old theory that we had them in submarines and they couldn't be detected, now with drones and surveillance, it's just no longer true. So, and it's completely dependent on the US, and nobody dares talk about it. So the question is, what went wrong? I mean, given that we were the biggest anti-nuclear movement, why did we so utterly fail in the British context? And I've been trying to think about this. I mean, I think it very much has to do with the history of the Labour Party. Yeah. And I was sort of thinking back to what happened because, and I'm going to tell this in a very personal way, because during the 1980s, I was a member of the Labour Party's, that they had these national executive subcommittees on defence. And on one of those committees, we wrote a report prior to the 1987 general election, in which we argued for the new détente. I was bringing all my experiences of our exchanges across the Cold War divide, and I was making the argument we should give up, this was before the end of the Cold War, we should give up nuclear weapons in exchange for the legalization of Polish solidarity. You know, what's important in Eastern Europe is human rights, and what's important in Western Europe is nuclear disarmament. And so why don't we make a big argument for the new détente? What actually happened was that the report was completed, was approved, but it was sunk without a trace because Peter Mandelson, who was then head of communications, thought this was not the way to win the election. And the Labour Party was committed at that time to being anti-nuclear, so his argument was we need to strengthen conventional defence, and by giving up nuclear weapons we can strengthen conventional defence. And they published a sort of pamphlet with a very big Union Jack on the front, and the polls showed that people were in favour of increased conventional defence, which he very proudly said was a result of their communication strategy. So that was the first thing that went wrong, but the biggest thing that went wrong was 1991, when Kinnock, some of you may remember, decided to change Labour Party policy, and it was just the wrong moment. We'd come to the end of the Cold War. He thought he would be more likely to win the 1991 elections. I suspect, I mean, I felt at the time it showed him to be not honest, and that it may have been a factor in him losing the 1991 elections, not that people may have cared that much about whether they stuck to their anti-nuclear, but it was a feeling that he was prepared to compromise to win power. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea, but I think the point is that had he stuck to the policy, we would never have come to the 1997 government and the decision to go ahead with modernisation. Nuclear weapons would have been phased out. And it's sort of tragic, because that was the moment, the 1990s, when we could have achieved something. And now it's become a taboo issue. Nobody wants to even talk about it. And I suppose this is really what I want to say as a last point, which is that, you know, Martin talks about the two phases of anti-nuclear activism. And what I feel is so striking about anti-nuclear activism is that it starts and suddenly it becomes electric and everybody's on it. And then when it goes away, nobody wants to talk about it. And it may be that it is really an insanity at the heart of government. I mean, it's a complete insanity. Every politician is expected to say, yes, I will use nuclear weapons. Luke and I were just discussing this earlier. I was before the 2017 election, I was at a meeting in Chatham House where Corbyn was. And the BBC person said, are you willing to press the button? And Corbyn said, I would think very seriously about it. And the BBC said, that's just terrible. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, well, if you were in that situation, wouldn't you think very seriously about it before you pressed the button? And he said, but I'm not a politician. And I thought, does that mean that in order to be a politician, you have to tell a lie? And there's that kind of insanity actually at the heart of government. You have to pretend to believe that you're willing to destroy the world in order to be respectable. And I just wonder whether that also does, I mean, why is it that we can't raise the issue? Because I think people can't bear to think about it, and when they do think about it, they have to do something. But most of the time we can't bear to think about it. And the question is, you know, how do we get people to start thinking about it? Because I think the current situation is very dangerous.
Thank you so much, Mary. There's so much there. I was thinking about the establishment question as well, but I guess from a different angle, because on the one hand, there's this story that you've told about the insanity at the heart of power. But the other thing that comes out in some of the cases in the book is that there was a lot of establishment opposition to nuclear weapons in the 20th century. Yeah. Reagan and Gorbachev coming pretty close in 1987 to ditch nuclear weapons altogether. And Reagan clearly being personally upset at the idea of nuclear war, and okay, it fed into its own brand of militarization. But you also talk as well about, and you mentioned it earlier, CND being started as kind of a lobbying group of the liberal establishment in a way, and not like the anarchist, performative, build a new world from below kind of thing. And I think as well as that's been lost in the 21st century, the consolidation of the establishment around this argument.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I think the, if you like, the liberal left establishment has changed a lot, really. I was thinking about it. One instance is the New Statesman, which in 1958 and in 1979 saw the key articles which called for activism and launched the two phases of anti-nuclear movement. It's very difficult to imagine that happening today. You know, the way that magazine has changed. And I think it represents a shift in the whole culture and ethos of the left establishment in this country, which separates it more from these sorts of concerns.
Is there anything else that Mary has said that you'd want to respond to? Take questions.
Well, I think what you were saying about Kinnock is significant. I mean, I think you could look at it as a broader issue, really. That at the end of the 80s and the very beginning of the 90s, there clearly was a big moment of opportunity, and political leaders of all stripes in the West and to some extent on the other side as well failed that challenge, and Kinnock is one example of that, because I mean, in the Kinnock's case, I think it's a shift from the Labour leaders earlier who actually believed in nuclear weapons, actually believed you needed to have them because they accepted the defence arguments, and now a Labour leader who believes you have to have nuclear weapons for the sort of electoral reasons that you were saying. I think there has been a shift because, and it reflects I suppose the shift. You know, in the very early days of nuclear weapons, people were still thinking in terms of fighting the sort of wars that had been fought in 1939-45, and just a little bit more destructive. But then it clearly went far beyond that, and it does represent this sort of insanity which people can't really engage with rationally. But the fact that the British Labour Party chose to ditch its anti-nuclear commitment just at the point when British nuclear weapons were manifestly most useless in political as well, geopolitical and political as well as in any other terms. I think that's really quite significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mary, just to come back to your argument about the end of the Cold War, the other thing that comes out of this, the book, in its discussion of 1989, 1990 as a moment, is the way in which the whole international order was broken up suddenly. In a way, everything kind of seemed possible. And I suppose this is to both of you really about European nuclear disarmament, but the book talks about your vision of the new post-Cold War order in that moment that wasn't put forward for the first time in 1990, but you had this argument about a world without the blocks, a world beyond the blocks, that some of the people you were engaging in Eastern Europe, like Václav Havel that is mentioned in the book, they joined the rush to push in Eastern Europe for NATO membership really very quickly. I think in 1990 the Czech Republic indicates that it wants to join NATO. So they rush towards the bloc. And I suppose these are people you were talking to very regularly in the East-West dialogues. You weren't able to convince them of the beyond the bloc argument, I suppose, in that sense. And I wondered why you think that there was this rush towards NATO membership as a goal among those states.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think I find it not so difficult to understand why there was a rush towards membership of NATO, but why there was such reluctance to let Russia join NATO. Because I think what we all were arguing for was that we wanted either the dissolution of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact and the replacement by the Helsinki process, which became known as OSCE, or NATO, if it was going to exist, could become the military arm of OSCE. But that only made sense if Russia had been allowed to join. And the question, I think, is less about the East European countries and more about why was the West so reluctant to let Russia become a member of NATO, because that way you'd have had and a lot of the things that have happened since, I mean, of course, you probably couldn't have prevented the rise of oligarchy in Russia, but I suspect, we wouldn't be where we are now if NATO had actually expanded, which Russia wanted. And it was an argument we were making even in those early days, that somehow we should bring this together. So I think that's the argument. Of course there was, I think the people that we talked to in Eastern Europe were probably quite a minority when it actually came to democracy. And there's a huge sort of feeling of anti-Russianness among those new East European countries. So I think that obviously, and I think there were a lot of things that we didn't understand about what happened. I do remember meeting Havel, and we posed this very question to him. We said we thought it was a bit disloyal of him to us.
What did he say?
He got very angry, actually. He got really angry, and he said, well, I've always been against Western intervention in Latin America. And I thought, he did get very cross with us for it. And so but he did talk, there was a division between them. There were some who talked about the Euro-Atlantic area. Maybe Patrick has followed this more closely than me. No, he says not.
Do you want to come in, Martin, or should we take?
No,
great. Any questions? Yeah, soon. We got a mic to go round. Yeah. Do you want to take this one? Yes.
Three questions.
Yeah, I think we'll do three. Should we go here first? I just saw you first.
Thank you very much. I'd like to first ask, basically in the 1980s, I personally recall that Gorbachev imposed a unilateral moratorium on nuclear weapons, banning further research and development as a goodwill gesture, and that Reagan and Thatcher chose to ignore it. Ultimately, I think it was the collapse of the Soviet Union that contributed to limitation of nuclear weapons. Well, the country was buckling under pressure, increasing costs, including weaponizing space, and this prevented the country from developing economically and developing its living standards. Wasn't that essentially part of a calculated strategy from the West?
There was quite a few. Put your hands up again. Yes, take this person here.
Thanks. I think I was drawing a lot of parallels there in terms of hard power versus soft power that are quite relevant still today. I think there were definitely some wins. I know some of it was a bit negative in terms of actual results, but I lived in New Zealand for 5 years on a street in central Auckland that still had nuclear disarmament murals up. So there definitely were some success stories. And just in light of, sort of Trump 2.0 and stuff, are there any examples of soft power, doing well against hard power that you think came out of the campaign that could possibly be used, in a new format in modern day?
Right, let's go back to Martin. So, new Cold War question and soft power.
Soft power victories.
Well, I think it's important to remember that the agreement to remove intermediate range nuclear weapons from Europe came before the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a period between 1985 and 1987 in which this dynamic of nuclear disarmament developed from Gorbachev's initiatives, but then embraced Reagan, and Reagan did actually engage with that, and that came before it became clear that the Soviet Union was likely to collapse, and which didn't really happen for some time afterwards. So, at a period in which I don't think this came about because of a Western strategy to cause the Soviet Union to collapse. I think if you read the history of the Soviet collapse, it is primarily because of internal factors, the contradictions within the Soviet state and society, and between the different components of that state as it started to open up. I mean, the West, especially the United States, played a role which was not always very constructive, and certainly wasn't very imaginative, and certainly didn't try to, I mean, basically, the United States encouraged Gorbachev, but at the same time was very reluctant to make decisive moves which would shift the whole thing in a different direction, as Mary, I think, was hinting at before. So that's how I see that. I mean, I think a little bit differently from you, perhaps. The soft power, I suppose, the whole history of the 1980s peace movement is a history of soft power undermining, at least the political face of hard power, because I mean, we haven't, because my book is about Britain, and we talked a bit about E&D, but in fact, there were peace movements across European countries in the 1980s. And this was a massive movement which wasn't simply called into being by our very good group of campaigners in this country, but it was something which grew up spontaneously in different places, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, and so on. And so these were massive movements, and they impacted. Both Gorbachev and Reagan were responding to some extent to these movements. They were making their moves in a way that was designed to counter or to take advantage of these movements. And what Mary was talking about, the way in which small initiatives, really, by people in E&D and the Interchurch Peace Council in the Netherlands and other Western European groups to make contact with civil rights activists and Democrats in Eastern European countries, helped to produce the massive democracy movements in Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s. I mean, by no means are they the main cause of those movements, but they are an element. And those movements in themselves, so I mean, responding in a way to the movements in the West, and in a bigger scale, not just in terms of contacts, but in the fact, so the 80s begin with these massive peace movements in Western Europe and end with massive democracy movements in Eastern Europe. And I think there's a symmetry, and both Soviet leaders, including Gorbachev, and Western leaders were really caught on the hop by these movements. They were responding to them. I mean, Gorbachev and Reagan believed that that they were negotiating the end of the Cold War in such a way as would see the Soviet Union continue in existence and would involve the democratization of the Eastern European countries. They didn't really, neither of them, I think, bargained for the force of popular opinion and the mobilizations which happened in countries like East Germany and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, so it made the end of the Cold War much more dramatic, I think, much more, and also much more unstable in a way than it would have been if it had simply been stitched up between the leadership. So that's some of my answer here, anyway.
Let's go over. Oh, let's go here first. Is you there?
Good evening. Just really wanting to take up from the discussion on the Labour Party and all this, and in particular the point Martin has raised about the Korean War. And it seems to me that Attlee's got off very lightly, particularly the second phase of the Korean War, when he, what I would say was sort of flagrant irresponsibility, tacking himself really to MacArthur's invasion of the North, barreling over the parallel, which led to the Chinese invasion and the Battle of the Yalu River. And so it's a sort of historiographical point I'm raising, I guess,
Yes.
if you want to comment on that.
The colleague over here.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Ewan Grant. I did work for a European Commission programme with, among others in Ukraine, the State Security Service, the successor to the KGB. They perhaps would take a slightly more sceptical view of some of the comments made. But my question is about CND funding. Did either of you personally receive funding from Soviet sources? And as far as you know, did CND receive such funding? I do have an acquaintance who was he's actually bizarrely named after a very notorious murderer who offered his services to the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. They turned him down. They regarded him as a nutcase. But they are still using him as an agent of influence. Russia now, even though he's been dead for over 60 years. So these things go deep and long. So what, I'm not expecting you to answer the personal question. If you want to, it's up to you. But was there any funding from Moscow? And if so, how was it done, and to what extent and how significant?
So in some ways, both those questions are quite connected, around the issues of McCarthyism and the 1950s and attitudes to the Soviet Union at the time. And I was wondering, when reading the book as well, how impacted were the activists in that period of high McCarthyism in the 1950s in Britain by the anti-communist fervour that was going on in the United States, and to what extent that sort of reached in to the UK and came up in how the police and intelligence services were, I don't know, engaging the anti-nuclear cause.
I think the gentleman there was talking about General MacArthur, not...
Oh, excuse me, sorry, in the Korean War.
Yes,
I misheard, excuse me.
Yes, yeah.
Actually.
But I mean, well, I mean, of course, the McCarthyite phase really preceded the anti-nuclear movement. The anti-nuclear movement came as after the Korean War, basically, and as McCarthyism was becoming less powerful, and of course, McCarthyism never existed in the same way in Britain as it was, you know, in its homeland. So, I mean, I think what's important is really that in the late 40s and the early 50s, when nuclear weapons were first being developed, Britain decided to develop its own bomb, although it wasn't known about. Britain was hosting American nuclear bases in a very big way. You know, the things we've already talked about were happening. That was the period in which the Cold War polarization was at its sharpest, and most of the Labour Party, as well as the Conservatives, were on the Atlantic US side of the Cold War. You know, there was a small section of the Labour Party and the trade unions, along with the Communist Party itself, who were on the other side. But the development of the anti-nuclear movement is really partly because that started to break down, and of course it broke down most spectacularly in 1956 with the Suez crisis and the Hungarian crisis, the Hungarian Revolution, and after that. You know, a large section of the left felt that you know, it was possible to move beyond the Cold War. We had the New Left, which was thinking in a different way about the possibilities, and that was one of the most important seeds of C&D, although there were lots of others. I mean, the question about come back to Korea in a moment. The question about funding. Nobody funded me because I was anyway a local organizer in the north of England. I don't think Moscow had heard of Hull, but I mean the only significant instance that I found in all of my research that was the campaign against the neutron bomb in the Netherlands in the late 1970s. Which has been established, was initially funded by East Germany, but that campaign was then overtaken by the campaign of the Interchurch Peace Council, which certainly wasn't funded by the Soviet bloc. And you see, although the British Communist Party was funded by the Soviet Union, and there were some individuals within CND who were members of the Communist Party. The CND and other anti-nuclear organisations in this country were never funded by the Soviet bloc. No. Well, were never funded by the Soviet bloc in any significant way that I'm aware of. So. Back to Attlee and Korea. I mean, I think we have this problem really with the history of the Labour Party and that. I mean, Attlee is now more or less sanctified as the founder of the welfare state, and Nye Bevan as the founder of the health service, and you know, because so the reforms of the 45-51 Labour government are seen as you know, as foundational and something to which any reforming government in Britain has to aspire. But we forget the extent to which Attlee was well, you know, totally committed and to the US alliance, and I mean, we have this remarkable twin, dual track situation, really. I mean, where Britain was part of the Manhattan Project and helped the United States to develop the atomic bomb in the first place, and then they're frozen out at the end of the war, and so they decide to develop their own bomb. But at the same time, so Attlee decides to develop the bomb in secrecy, with a small number of ministers involved, and at the same time, they make this massive commitment to US nuclear bases or US military bases in Britain to allow the Strategic Air Command to a whole range of bases and to develop a nuclear capability, which leads on to what I was talking about before the Thor thing. And yes, I mean Korea. Well, I agree with what you said. Basically, I mean, I think it is. But I think I would see this as a problem. If we're thinking about the Labour Party in this country, which we obviously should be thinking about today. Nye Bevan is another case, isn't he? I mean, today we think of him, founder of the NHS. We don't think of him as the man who went into the Labour Party conference and shot down the anti-nuclear resolution in 1957, which is another very important moment.
Hmm. And I suppose it's all bound up in that period of history of the fight to keep the European empires going. I mean, the other quite well-known case of the US suggesting the use of the nuclear bomb was to the French Empire in the First Vietnam War, immediately following the Second World War. And the French colonial authorities turned around and said, well, don't you realise we've got loads of our own people in the country that will be affected by the fallout from the use of such a weapon. Of course we're not going to use this weapon. So I think empire in that moment in the 50s was such a big part of this story. Mary, is there anything you want to come back on from that?
I mean, it's such a fascinating story. And there's a lot, I mean, I think on the issue of funding, I think, when we founded END, part of Edward Thompson's motivation, it wasn't to do with funding, but it was to do with the fact that CND, it had always been quite successfully easy to marginalise CND by accusing them of being fellow travellers. And by taking up the issue of human rights, it made it much more difficult to do that. And I think there were always attempts. I mean, I certainly had income tax investigations that were no doubt looking for Soviet money. There were always attempts to find out. And there were also attempts by the Soviet peace committees. I mean, I remember we had a meeting with the Soviet peace committees and they said, stop supporting dissidents. And if you don't, we will make life as difficult as you can. And the result was that some of the communist members of CND did behave badly at meetings for a little while, but that was the most that happened. So I think that's always been a sort of theme throughout everything. But on the issue, I'm really fascinated by the issue of Attlee and what happened in the 1940s. And I don't know, some of you may have seen this week in the New Statesman, there was an article by John Bew, who's the biographer of Attlee and who then became Boris Johnson's national security advisor, arguing the case for a kind of Attlee-type geopolitics. And of course, anyone who's read that book, Attlee fought in the First World War, was wounded in Gallipoli, and always thought that Churchill was a brilliant strategist, and all that went along with Gallipoli was the implementation. And his brother was a conscientious objector and was imprisoned for the whole of the war. And one of the bits I liked about the book, which showed they were very nice, was that their mother said, I don't know which son I'm most proud of. But anyway, the other thing I really wanted to say something about the 40s, the late 40s and the Cold War. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I think there was always a strand that came out of the European resistance that wanted, and Edward Thompson was very committed to this because his brother was in the resistance in Bulgaria, of an idea of a united socialist democratic Europe that was neither the US nor the Soviet Union. And I think that was a really important strand. I mean, I was very much struck when we founded END how many people were the children of the resistance. So I think that strand was a strong strand as well as even in the late 40s. But the other thing I wanted to say, I don't know how many people remember Philip Noel Baker, who was a great figure in the peace movement. And he's extraordinary in that he won the Nobel Peace Prize and he was an Olympic gold medalist. Can you imagine being both those things? And I once asked him, was there anything he regretted in his life? And he was a conscientious objector during the Second World War, and as a consequence, happily made him Minister for the Air Force. And he said, what I really regret is that I wasn't Foreign Secretary because we would never have had a Cold War. And I think, when I think about what happened in that period, I don't think it was just that Attlee was a sort of geopolitical thinker. I think it was all about economics. I think Ernie Bevin, who was the Foreign Secretary, they couldn't afford the empire. They couldn't afford their section of Germany that they were occupying. They didn't have enough money. At the end of the war, Congress halted Lend-Lease. And it was Bevin's idea that by emphasizing that we Social Democrats are quite different from communists and are fighting the communist idea, it was a way of getting the money back flowing. And I think people underestimate, we hear an awful lot about martial aid, but actually the American presence in Germany produced more in the way at a time of dollar shortage than martial aid did. So he created NATO, Bevin, more than the Americans did. He started with the Brussels Treaty with, who was in it, France, the Benelux countries, and he said it was the thing he was most proud of. And Bevin, by the way, was a pro-European on the grounds that it would be great if Europe could pool our colonies. So I think Bevin is the real villain. I don't know, Attlee went along with it, of course, and I think the most important factor was actually economic rather than ideological. It was a way of ensuring that the flow of dollars continued to flow. Britain was totally broke.
Well, that has resonance for today, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Really interesting. I'm just looking over here because I haven't taken a question from this quadrant. Would anyone like to ask one? Yes, lady over here.
Hi, it's more of a, thank you very much for the talk. It's more of a comment. I'm French, and we do demonstrations and things like this quite a lot. There was an exhibition a few years back at the Imperial War Museum about the peace movement, and I work here at SC in the archive team, by the way. But I was amazed to think why does this country doesn't see itself as it was at the moment of Brexit, and I thought, well, this is also Britain. This is in the culture, this movement of resistance, whether it's a conscious objection or all the peace movement at CND or whatever, campaigns against arms trade, etc. Don't you think the big problem in this country is and you mentioned Kinnock and then Tony Blair, but isn't it the first past the post system, and the fact that you have a huge amount of people who are, want peace or want, that's what you see, the biggest demonstration for Palestine are in the UK, probably in the world, I think. Maybe, in the Western world, let's put it that way. So yeah, isn't that the big problem? That was my
Yeah, and let's go to, yes, colleague over here. I think you're right though, that in one of the progressive identities that I think comes out of a lot of the themes of the library from here and the huge number of progressive archives that they have here, is that progressives in the UK have never really taken up the idea of Englishness and Britishness. And so there's a sort of detachment in some ways from those progressive movements and the ability to sort of claim them as part of a national story, even though in many ways they are. So I think you've touched on something important there. Yeah, let's take this colleague here.
Well, I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but it was about the decline of CND in those two periods. I was very active in the early 60s. In fact, I worked at the head office of CND. And the reason it did, well, there were several reasons why it declined in the mid-60s. First of all, we had, first of all, the test ban treaty, which banned tests in the atmosphere. And then in my local group, they were all members of the Labour Party as well as CND. And when the 1964 election was coming up and Harold Wilson was elected Prime Minister, oh, we don't need CND now, we'll work within the Labour Party. Because 1960, the Labour Party had gone unilateralist, was to get rid of all Britain's nuclear weapons. There was also, of course, the Cuba crisis, which we got through. And both sides had to backtrack. It wasn't just the Soviets. Kennedy had to remove his missiles from the Soviet border in Turkey as well. And of course, in the second wave, the cruise missiles were removed. So that was a success, you know. And as to funding, well, I ended up doing all C&D's accounts and we never got anything from the Soviets at all. I'm sure you know. That's why you introduced membership, 1966. We introduced
they
national
are very
membership
good at disguising it.
so we had funding, we could rely on funding. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And that brings us nicely to the end. As the Cuban Missile Crisis has been mentioned a few times this evening, and there are some younger members of the audience who might not have seen this film, because I expect most people have, but if you haven't seen the film 13 Days, you must watch it, because it brings out the crisis really, really brilliantly. And what I think it shows really well is that this was the high point of the idea on the Americans that they would fight a nuclear war and win a nuclear war, because the Kennedy brothers really successfully had to stand down that argument from the Pentagon very, very directly. So concluding thoughts, let's go to Mary first and then go to Martin to sum up.
Yeah, I do think first past the post is a problem, is a huge problem, actually. But I don't think it's the only problem. I mean, I keep thinking to myself, why is it at the moment, and this is nothing to do with the past and CND and everything, but why is it that our politicians seem to think they have to compromise with the right, but not compromise with the left? I just don't understand it, really. Why do they feel they have to chase these few numbers? And I wish I could, I mean, I think it's not just that. There's something about the psychology of winning elections that's really problematic, but it's a whole different subject. We shouldn't get into it, but I've been thinking about it a lot. So
it's happening in France too.
It's happening in France. I mean, in France, it's even more ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's completely ridiculous.
Yeah, you're right.
And you don't have first past the post. So, you know, it's logical that the centre should be cooperating with the left, and that would be much better than cooperating with the right. And they're just very resistant to doing it. And I don't understand the reason, and maybe somebody will think of the reason. I'm sure there was something else that I was supposed to... I mean, yours was a comment, which was a great... It was history, and it was great. And I don't think I have anything.
Great.
to add.
Great, let's go to Martin to sum up. But thanks for coming to the LSE to present your book, and I hope everyone goes away and buys a copy. I should have said at the beginning, Martin has written many books, and I mean, his work on genocide is grimly relevant, tragically, to the conjuncture that we're in 2025. So if you're not familiar with that work, you do go away and find it. And we really sort of became contacts, if you like, during the high stage of anti-Brexit activism, which in some ways was a successor in a complicated way, I think, of these pro-democratic transnational movements. And Martin has also written a great book making the really important point that Brexit was and should be recognised as something that was entangled with racism. So don't need to respond to that, but I just thought I'd mention it. But concluding thoughts.
Actually, first of all, I'll just say that you thank me for coming to LSE. It's coming back really because I was originally a student here many moons ago, and so I mean it's nice to be here and to have such an informed and interesting audience.